All right, what we're going to talk about today is local password attacks. We're specifically going to focus on the methodology, encryption methods that are used, and then we're going to talk about John the Ripper as a particular tool. This is not a class about John the Ripper. This is about local password attacks. There's a distinction I want to make there because what we need to understand is that there are a lot of different variables that are involved, and if we pay attention to those variables and plan for them, we can improve our chance of recovering some of these passwords. Okay, we got a bit of a slide presentation to go through here, about 10 slides. I use the slides to make sure that I cover all the material that I really want to cover, and so we'll just go ahead and begin. Regarding the methodology, since we're using the ISSAF for this class, there is a specific section that I want to talk about, and that's section D. And it goes through quite a variety of different scenarios and ways to apply yourself to gain information, and I would strongly encourage students to view this. It starts on page 174 and goes for about 60 some pages, if I'm not mistaken. It steps you through different levels of attack depending on your location, is primarily, and then of course your authority on the system. Each one of these is a valid attack platform or attack vector. Just understand that this is not necessarily something you will do in every pen test, because the scope itself might dictate exactly what you can and cannot do. And it's not unusual also in a real world pen test to start off with very limited access, simply just internet access, and then be able to elevate your privileges so that you're actually within the network. It's almost like there's only two steps, little access and a lot of access. Again, that depends on the client and the scope statement. They want to save time, or they want to attack specific vectors. But the ISSAF outlines 6 possibilities. Goes from the least privilege to the greatest privilege. Least privilege to the greatest privilege. It starts off with just simple internet access, where you're trying to glean information, just connecting to the web service or whatever service they provide. The next step is something similar to basically a visitor with a laptop. The situation is you walk into a facility, you connect that laptop into a network, and then you go from there. You see what you can access. Again, you don't have any direct access to a system, but you see what you can access that way. Then they elevate, or the next step would be local host as an insider pen tester, which is simply a user with limited privileges. And then the next step after that would be more of an admin that has access to remote systems. This is where your network authentication to as an outside administrator. In other words, you're looking for systems on the network, but this time you approach it from an administrative point as opposed to simply a user. Then they move you a little bit higher into the network with the idea that you could sniff the network traffic. That would be the D5 section, and then the D6 section would be local host and as administrator. So you are administrator or root. So those are the different stages that the ISSAF suggests, and you will typically do at least one of them. I mean, the internet access is something you probably always will try to do, but it's not unusual to get 2 or 3 of these as part of your scope statement. And again, they will simply give you, your client will give you access depending on what they want to test. So that's the methodology. Those are the steps that you take to identify and grab credentials. But the question is, what happens when you actually get those? And that's the next part I'm going to talk about a lot in more detail, because it really does play into how well you actually how well you take those collected passwords and turn them into passwords that you can use to actually access systems. What we're going to talk about is dictionaries. Now, there are two ways to approach an attack, and one of them is through dictionaries, or brute force is the other option. Dictionaries is you have a very defined amount of words that you're going to try. And the tools that we're going to talk about, John the Ripper specifically, can use either. You just basically tell it what you need it to do. But the dictionaries allow us to make things quicker. The idea is that most people use some common words or a combination of common words. And so what we want to try initially is to do a dictionary attack, and if we can collect some passwords, that's great. We'll set them aside, and the ones that we did not crack, then we can try to do a brute force attack. The problem with the brute force is it takes so much time that we have to assign enough resources and time to be able to do that part. That's why dictionaries are so nice, is that it allows us to gather a bunch of passwords quickly, hopefully enough to exploit the system. So let me talk a little bit about dictionaries and what the ISSAF says that you need to do. You need to obtain a small international and a medium local dictionary. The reason why international English, they say, primarily, is because most the computer world focuses on the English language. Torvald, when he developed Linux, he wrote and noted everything in English because that's what he was comfortable doing in a computer environment. Of course, he prefers to speak in his own natural tongue when he's doing everything else, but it was a natural thing for him to do. So there's a lot of English words across the world, especially in a computer environment. So you want to make sure that you at least include an English dictionary. And then notice the larger dictionary, the medium size, is a local dictionary. So what we're looking for is the language of the users and the language of the system administrators. Those are going to be, the passwords are going to come out of that dictionary more frequently than an English dictionary, even if it, especially if it's overseas. And I'm of course talking about outside of the United States. Something else that you need to look for is any information that you have gathered, and that could include the partners' names, the children's names, pets' names. Also, you look at the individual's hobbies. There's a complete vernacular and technical terminology that's used in those, whether or not, depending on the topic. I talk about people who collect butterflies. There's a bunch of different names for butterflies. There's different terminology that's used. So people will use those words that they think about most often throughout the day. It's not necessarily something you'll find in a dictionary. It can easily be something that is very specialized. So use the information that you've gathered to add to your dictionaries those words that represent what that individual, your target, is interested in, and that they have a direct connection with. You also need to look at the formatted and unformatted dates, and they say go about 60 years. This is things like birthdays, anniversaries. It's also major events within the country. Here in the United States, 9/11 is a more recent event that a lot of people will be thinking about, so that's something that they might include in their passwords. So those are the kind of things that we're talking about. Also, they say the name of soccer, football, basketball teams. That includes the players. That also includes players who are no longer playing, but have made a note in the history of that sport. So you'll want to include people like Wayne Gretzky and whoever else is popular based on the interests of your targets. Also use, they say, notorious TV people, people who are famous, people who are infamous. The latest criminals are also very popular. People have a real fascination with crime and the mafia for some reason. So a lot of people will use TV stars, will use some of the more edgy drama-like TV shows. Talk about people, character names, the actual actors' names. So those are things that you need to add as well. Then also people will use registration codes, register codes, as passwords as well. So if a company gives out a series of numbers to their employees for tracking purposes and payroll, etc., try those as well, or at least figure out what the format is and then try them, because people will tend to use them not only to help remember that number, but also it's easy to recover. And then any other information that you might have gained during your information gathering phase or your vulnerability identification phase. All right, so does anybody have any questions on the methodology that the ISSAF lays out? Okay. There's a couple things we need to be familiar with when we're talking about encryption. The first one is the use of salt. The use of salt was created in order to provide additional complexity to encrypted passwords. Those systems that do not use salt, and that would be Microsoft primarily, they do not use any sort of additional randomized variables to apply to the encryption process, so that when a word is encrypted in a no salt environment, the resulting encryption value will be identical each and every time that same password was used initially. When you use a salt and you add some additional variables to it, and in fact it's this center part between the second and the third $, and I'm highlighting it there, when that salt is added to the original password, it provides a different output. And in fact, the two salt values here, or the two encrypted values, use the exact same password, which is password. But you'll notice that we get completely different results, and the actual encrypted results is the information provided after the $. And so these two are obviously completely different, even though the original password, clear text password, is password. So when we deal with encryption that includes salt, we pretty much have to go straight to brute force attacks. Now we can still use a dictionary, don't get me wrong, but we cannot use a rainbow table. This is something that a lot of people get confused on, when they can and cannot use a rainbow table. The idea is that behind a rainbow table, and I'll talk about it again, the idea behind a rainbow table is that we create as many possible hashes, or we encrypt as many different passwords as possible, so that we have a repository that we can simply do a quick lookup. In other words, when we go to a system and we see 5F blah blah blah, and we go look on our rainbow tables, we'll find a 5F blah blah blah. We therefore know that that equals exactly the word password. With the salt, we cannot do that, because if you'll notice how many variables, it's uppercase, lowercase, and numbers in the salt, each of those provides additional complexity that would basically require millions of different results just for one password. Rainbow tables, one password, one encrypted result. Right. The other thing we need to focus on when we're dealing with encryption is base64 versus Unicode. Now, when somebody uses an encryption algorithm, the algorithm itself does not care if the information is in base64 or Unicode. Where the difference comes in, and when it's used one over the other, is when programmers take the values, the password, from the user, and then manipulates it. Whether then they might move it into base64, or they might leave it in Unicode. Unicode is a larger set of characters, so it's a little bit more intensive as far as space and computation. So a lot of people have gone with base64. And what ends up happening is special characters have to be converted into base64 before it gets processed in the encryption algorithm. In the case that we have here, we use the same word, pinion, but what happened was through one encryption of MD5 using base64, it had to convert that N with the tilde on top into base 64 value, which was the ampersand pound sign 241 semicolon. The resulting MD5 can be seen above under base 64, and you'll notice that there's a couple equal signs. That's actually to fill out the rest of the MD5 hash. Those are actually fillers. A lot of people will focus on that, and I'll tell you why you shouldn't necessarily here in a second. The password in the Unicode using this pinion produced a different value, but the reason why I mention that people focus on that equal sign is because often people will say, well, you only see the equal sign in base 64. You will only see it in base 64, but the other thing you got to recognize is that the algorithm that the programmer has created to encrypt the values may or may not include an equal sign at the end, depending on how they've done it. So our problem presented here is that word lists are typically provided in Unicode. So if you got a Spanish dictionary, it would have pinion with the N with a tilde on top instead of PI ampersand pound sign 241 semicolon 0 or ON. So there is a problem right then and there that we have to recognize, is that unless we can identify what method they're using in their encryption method, we may be missing valid low-hanging fruit passwords simply because we have not converted the special characters into base 64 characters. All right. So the next question people have is, well, how do we know the difference? How do we know what to use? Unfortunately, we don't. There is no good way to identify which passwords have been encrypted using Unicode and which ones have been encrypted using base 64. Again, systems use their own encryption methods. So Unix to Unix system, one might use base 64, one might use Unicode. You cannot rely on the assumption that Unix uses one or the other. So also you cannot be assured that the process is the same between applications. Just because you log in with a Windows app doesn't mean that it's stored in Unicode, yet if you look at the password stored on the system, it might be. So you've got to be flexible in your understanding that Unicode and base 64 both exist in this encryption world, and as a pen tester, you have to deal with both. You cannot also rely on that equal sign, like I said earlier, because sometimes it doesn't show up. The values in the Havel 192 presented below are identical. The one is Unicode and one is base 64. The password is identical though. So it provides us some information there that you can't always trust what you see just to be able to determine whether it's Unicode or base 64. Okay, questions? All right. It's an important distinction, and we're going to deal with that later on here. But I'm going to move into some discussions on window systems right now, and we're going to talk about the LAN manager passwords. If you actually obtain a LAN manager password from a Windows system, typically from a SAM file, or it could be from the SAM recovery file, this is what it looks like. You have your username, your ID for the user, and then it divides the password into two halves. This is going to be very important. Something else that you need to understand is that there is a finite number of characters that are allowed in a LAN manager password schema. Let me move on to the next slide, and we'll discuss it in greater detail. These are the 6 steps that are required for LAN manager to go through in order to convert a plain text password into a LAN manager encrypted password. The first step is that the user's ASCII password is converted to uppercase. There's some padding that goes on. The highlighted areas are things I really want to focus on. After the ASCII password is converted into uppercase, the next thing that we need to focus on is that it's broken into 2 7-byte halves, which means that 7 characters is in each half. So if we're talking about the word password, the first half of the LAN manager password is split into a PASSWOR, and the second half contains the letter D. Now, that's important if you think about it, that means every time somebody uses the exact same 7 characters in their password, in the beginning of their password, that part of that LAN manager, going back, that part in blue will be identical each and every time. So if I'm using passwords, the first part will still be identical to PASSWOR. If I use passwords 1, 2, 3, the first part of the LAN manager encryption will still be PASSWOR. And because Microsoft does not use SALT, we therefore have the same hash each and every time. It's actually DES. So which means it's actually an easier encryption algorithm to break. All right, that's one of the problems that I see with LAN manager. Now, Microsoft, I'm not a spokesman, but they would probably put out an argument that said it's not the encryption algorithm that's the problem, it is the complexity of the passwords that is a problem. I would agree to a large extent, but I still think that it would have been sensible to use a stronger algorithm and not to divide it up into 2 halves. The other thing that I want to focus on is that it creates 2 DES keys. So each of those were DES. And so when you break a LAN manager password, you'll have the 2 different parts that you need to combine together. And that's actually what we talk about at the end here, is that there's a 16-byte value, which is the actual LAN manager hash. Now, question has come up before, if it's broken up into 2 7-byte halves, what if the password is longer than 14 characters? Everything after 14 characters is ignored. So when people have long passwords, but then they cycle the numbers after that 14 characters, the system will not recognize it as a new password. Okay. Any questions about LAN manager? All right, then let me go ahead and move on to the next topic. So the next slide is John the Ripper. When we talk about using John the Ripper, we're primarily talking about a brute force attack. Now, we also use John the Ripper as a word list. It's an easy way of doing these password attacks, and I typically say that's the first thing you should do, and then whatever you don't recover, you send it back to do a brute force. Now, it does take time, so you need to make sure that the project manager or yourself has set aside enough time to allow John the Ripper to do its job as a brute force attack. Now, when we're talking about local password attacks compared to remote, these local ones are much more critical to obtain, to crack. So you need to put a higher priority on cracking local passwords because they're valid, and you're able to do them locally as well, so you don't have to worry about intrusion detection systems, etc. But it will allow you to potentially get elevated privileges on a system if you can gain access to that local password list. So the priority for local passwords is much higher than remote passwords. So you need to make sure that you set aside time to do this brute force attack. Assuming, of course, you're talking about systems that are using SALT to encrypt their passwords. If they're not using SALT, as a reminder, you can use rainbow tables because the output from the encryption algorithm will always be the same if you use the same password going into it. Now again, the rainbow tables, all the work has been done beforehand. The hashes are pre-generated, and it's a fairly simple lookup. It's just a compare and contrast. There are tools on Backtrack, and one of the things I would suggest, it's not critical yet, but one of the things I would suggest doing is start creating your own rainbow tables. Now they are large. You basically will create a large number of these values for the table, So you need to get half a terabyte or a terabyte drive, which the price of course has come down quite dramatically in the last few years. And then retain that drive just for rainbow tables. And I would fill it. I would absolutely fill it. Make sure that you have all the hashes that you can cram into that as possible, so that when you do go on site and you do gain access to a system, then you can actually use a large rainbow table to identify weak passwords. So questions about that, John the Ripper versus rainbow tables? All right, the next step we're going to do is we're going to talk about John the Ripper a little bit. Now we're not actually going to use John the Ripper. I'm going to show you some examples. And it's kind of a hodgepodge, so I apologize for that. But we'll get through all of them. And if you have any questions, please don't stop. Stop me and ask. Now, most people have had access and have played with John the Ripper. I'm going to shift focus here in a second. So I'm not going to go into that much detail about John the Ripper. There are some tutorials out on the internet. It's fairly simple. A lot of times you can just type in the executable and then the file name, and then you let it go. And that file name will contain the actual encrypted passwords. But there are a couple other things I want to point out. Number one is that I encourage everybody to use the session tag. The reason why is if you have to stop John the Ripper, then you have used a session tag, then you can use the restore option to pick up where you left off. Otherwise, it'll just stop where it is. Another thing that I want to point out is that you have the ability to use a word list, and again, that is your dictionary or dictionaries, and I again suggest using that initially. And then if that doesn't work, then you move on to the brute force component. Then there's also another thing, pot, that allows you to, that's the file that actually retains the converted encrypted hash into the password. So that pot, john.pot will actually contain the results, those passwords that were broken. It will not contain all of the ones that it's tried, just the ones that have actually broken. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. So let me take a look at some of the passwords that I went through over the last few days. The first one I want to talk about is the MD5 PHP BBS. There are certain formats to the output of these encrypted values, and I'll show you them here in a minute, that can clue in on exactly what algorithm used them, or actually what program, what application encrypted the passwords. In this case, it was able to recognize that it was a PHP BBS, which is a form, and the password in this case was actually password. The encrypted MD5 was used the word password as its input. Another one I want to point to is Oracle. Now this was actually MySQL, but it didn't recognize it as a distinct different database. The reason why is databases themselves are case insensitive. When you're dealing with passwords from a database, you can clean up your dictionary a bit, because if you use capitalization in your dictionary, it doesn't matter to an Oracle database whether it's uppercase, lowercase, or a mixed. And in fact, it will tell you that some candidates' passwords may be unnecessarily tried more than once. So if I try password with a capital P and a password with a little p, it would have had the same result coming out of it if it had actually been the word password. So uppercase, lowercase, it doesn't really matter when you're dealing with databases. Now I used SHA-1 against password. Now this shows you SHA-1 is a more complex encryption algorithm, but it was able to find it fairly quickly because it was pretty much low-hanging fruit. No big surprise there. And then the other one I want to show you is, well, there was an MD5 WordPress. I tried to make it a little bit more complicated by adding a 1 at the end. No big deal. Found that fairly quickly. 8 seconds. That's how long, extra long it took to add a 1 to the end. Right. So let's show you some things that didn't work too well. So I tried a password capital A, capital S, capital D, capital F. And when I sent it to John the Ripper, it tried DES. And now DES is a fairly weak encryption algorithm. Because ASDF is not complicated, it's 4 characters. It's actually the first 4 characters on the center row of your keyboard. DES was able to find it in pretty much no time at all. I used the exact same password, but I encrypted it using MD5. I didn't use WordPress, I didn't use PHP, which is actually weaker for some reason. I haven't gone into the details of those particular algorithm setups, but when John the Ripper tried to find ASDF using just using the MD5 hash, you'll notice that it took almost 2 days, and I stopped it. I actually aborted the session because I didn't want to wait more than that 2 days. And that was just for ASDF, all caps, 4 characters. So you can see that the brute force obviously takes much more time. So if we can find a dictionary that matches the ASDF, then we would have saved a whole lot of time, especially if it had been encrypted using MD5. Okay, questions on that? Questions on John the Ripper? All right. Now let me show you the results of Unicode versus base 64. In this case, I used the backtrack system to encrypt the word pinion, and then I made it my root password right now. And then this shows me that since I used a dictionary, I used a Spanish dictionary, as we can see here, it shows that it identified Unicode. So in other words, the way it's programmed for backtrack is that the user can input Unicode characters, and that those Unicode characters will be converted into MD5 hash with salt. And then so John the Ripper can use a dictionary with that Unicode in there to identify those encrypted passwords. Now, I used another word, and this was actually a French word, entrée, that has a caret above the E. And what I did is I used a different methodology of encrypting that same password using a dictionary attack instead of a brute force attack. And the end result was, again, of that particular password is that it identified the base 64, not the Unicode. So whatever algorithm I used before, which was straight MD5, Unix actually, it identified the characters as Unicode, converted them into base 64. So what's actually stored on the system is the ampersand #234, TRE. Now remember that when people log on to systems, what you're doing is you're encrypting the password every time, and then you do a comparison of the encryption that the user just put in versus what's stored on the system. So as long as that process is identical each and every time from when the user inputs it to when it gets stored on the system, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's in base 64, it doesn't matter if it's Unicode. It will always recognize it the same way. But for us, it makes a big difference because of our dictionary. If it only includes Unicode, then we miss out on some very obvious words. And entrée is actually one of the, I think it's like within the top 5 words used in the French language. And so if we just used Unicode, it wouldn't have found it until it got to the point where it was trying the 7, 8, 9, 10 characters for entrée, and it was using ampersand, # and a semicolon. So that just tells you that we need to tailor our dictionaries to meet those habits or the vernacular or the language of our targets, not just download a dictionary or use what's given to us and then try to brute force it or use a dictionary. It just doesn't make sense when we're talking about simple words, and we just did not take the time to convert them into base 64. All right, any questions about that? I'm pretty much done with John the Ripper. Next thing I want to talk about is the password file that I've included for this week's conversation. But again, does anybody have any questions so far on John the Ripper or anything we've talked about so far? So, as promised, there is some additional material to work on to improve your skills, and this will definitely consume some time for the rest of this week. Now, this file contains a variety of different challenges for you, some easier, some more difficult. The first set of encrypted values I've provided you all use the exact same password, which in this case is password. And then it shows you, just by looking at it, you can see here again is we're using a salt. Here's the second $sign, so anything after that is the actual salt itself. And then anything after the third $sign is the actual encrypted value, the output. We notice that there are some other formats. The $P is WordPress. Again, I don't know the way they've done it. For all I know, there is some salt in here. I don't know, but I suspect there is not, based on how the speed of converting these into real words. So there's MD5, but you can distinguish an MD5 by the $P. The PHP BBS uses a $H. And then another $, and again, I'm thinking that it's probably just straight MD5 hash. SHA-1 is much more complicated, and it will take more time just to find the word password. Now, again, you can point it to a dictionary, or you can let it brute force, and I would suggest doing both, just to kind of see how it works out. Now, I included base 64. It's not really an encryption method, but it allows you to at least look and see what the value is, what base 64 sees password as, which again will just be password actually. Our MySQL, NTLM, which is NT LAN management, which is the network stuff as opposed to the system, which is, so it's different from LAN manager. NT LAN manager is different from LAN manager. And then the MD5 itself, straight up. All right, now I also included another password 1. We went through the exact same encryption methods, so you can again play with that to see what difference it makes just by adding a single character. I mentioned earlier that the ASDF all caps for characters provided some complexity to some of these algorithms. My suggestion again is to try them, go through them, and see which ones give you the greater headaches. Now, the reason why I want you to try that is so that you understand how much time you have to spend just cracking a single password on the different algorithms. So when you go up against a system and you see that it's using DES, like Microsoft stuff, and let's say you do not have access to a rainbow tables, you'll know that the LAN manager passwords are based on DES, so it's going to be a fairly simple crack anyway. You're not going to get it, all 100 passwords or, 10% of those passwords in a matter of a minute or two, but you will get a decent result compared to the amount of time you would spend on MD5 Unix hash. So again, that's one of the reasons why I'm having you do this, is so you know the pain involved in each of these different encryption methods. The next set is Pinion. It includes that Unicode, and then you'll be able to, I suggest that you use a single dictionary, Pinion, and find out which one of these, particularly the ones that I've set up for you, whether it uses Unicode or whether it uses base 64. Now, I'll also give you a little bit of warning, is that I can set it up for either way. Again, it's the programmer who uses the encryption algorithm that gets to decide whether it's Unicode or base 64. It's not the algorithm itself. I also included some LAN manager passwords as well to play against. Now, I actually grabbed these off the internet. I'm not going to take credit for them, but I've included the passwords in the beginning of the as the username actually. So that test user one. So the first 7 characters, it breaks out into that, and then the rest of them is this part of the encryption. So we got test user one, password, blah, blah, blah. So try each of these and see what kind of difference it makes. You can also generate your own and try them against to see how John the Ripper handles uppercase, lowercase, things like that. Now, that's the easy part. Those I gave you all the passwords for those. The next part is an actual challenge, and this is what you should be able to do and should be comfortable with. I give you an American company as a target, and in this case I used salted MD5 passwords for all of them. Add a little bit more complexity. The reason why is because in this case the American company, going back to the ISSAF methodology, means that you will use an English dictionary. I would suggest at least a medium, perhaps a large, and that you do not have to worry obviously about additional Unicode, because ASCII is based on American letters, nothing special there. But at least the additional complexity is the fact that it is salted, and some of these may or may not be the same password. I'll let you figure that one out. I also included a French company, so you have to identify French dictionary that's out there. Then you need to also potentially modify it for base 64. All of these words are fairly common, so you should be able to decrypt every single one of them. Now, I also provided additional, not complexity, but a little bit of different flavor, is that you'll notice each of the different lines has different encryption methods. So since we see the $1, we know that it's Unix and MD5. We see the $H, and if we go back up here, $H is used by PHP BB3 or BBS. So I added a bunch of different algorithms. One of the things that I'm going to warn you about is sometimes John does not like multiple algorithms in the same list. Sometimes it'll skip, so it might see, and this is something you should try, is throwing all of them at the same time, but you might see that John identifies this one and maybe this one and tries to hack them, but ignores the other ones. It's not uncommon in my personal experience to have to, in a mixed environment, typically you don't see it, you get all of it off of one system, but in a mixed file, it will oftentimes be necessary to take them out and have a single file for each individual line. Just be aware of that. And then I did the same thing as far as mixing the different encryption methods for a German company. Again, there's a possibility of uppercases. The Germans use uppercase for proper nouns all the time, so you're going to have a mixed bag. Now you got to identify those things are uppercase and lowercase. Do you include lowercase? Maybe you should. You know, for words that are typically uppercase German. Also, they use Unicode. There's characters in there that don't necessarily meet what's used in the English language. So maybe you need to start planning for base 64. So these are the challenges for you for the rest of the week. These are actually, I believe, very good challenges and realistic challenges. It will get you through. I mean, again, these are common words, so it's not a time waster necessarily. It is an exercise in understanding all the different flavors that you encounter doing a decryption of encrypted passwords. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about the password file and what you're supposed to do for the rest of the week? Okay. If no questions, then I will, at this point, say we have concluded today's lesson. Now, I will give you an opportunity to hang out if you want to. I will stay on the line for the next 10 minutes, and then if you guys want to stay online, you're welcome to. Otherwise, you can bail, no problem. You've got your assignment. Everybody, I'm assuming, got the link and was able to download it successfully. If you have any problems, that link is still in your Skype chat, and it should be available all the time until I take it down next week. For those that are going to leave, I appreciate your time. Again, if you have any questions during the week, please do not hesitate to contact me. Otherwise, for those that are bailing now, I will talk to you at least this time next week.